be a real stickler for remembering the purpose of Memorial Day. Memorial Day is, of course, a federal holiday that's meant to honor and remember all those soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen who died in any war or military action. Maybe I was a stickler in part because, as some of you know, I'm a veteran of the U.S. Navy, served for 4 years active duty in the early 90s. It was during the time of the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. I never did serve in the Gulf, nor in combat, just so I'm clear. But perhaps because of my experiences serving during a time of war, for years I tried my hardest to keep the Memorial Day focus on the U.S. troops who died in war and military actions, and really on those people alone. It just seemed to me that there should be one day a year when we pause to remember them, those who died in battles that their own country sent them to fight. It was the Civil War that inspired the idea for having a Memorial Day. There were almost 215,000 combat deaths between the Union and Confederate sides, and that death toll essentially doubles to about 400,000 if you count deaths outside of combat from disease and other war hardships. To give some perspective, more than 291 service members died in World War II, U.S. troops. Nearly 34,000 died in Korea. More than 47,000 U.S. troops died in Vietnam. Now, only 147 U.S. troops died in combat during the Gulf War, during my time in the Navy, as if only could be an appropriate word to describe any tragic premature death. To date, 4,571 U.S. troops have died in Iraq, and 2,426 have died in Afghanistan. That's just about 7,000 combat deaths in Iraq and Afghanistan. All told, since the American Revolution, a grand total of 657,000 U.S. troops have died in combat. To quote the poet Archibald MacLeish, they say, "We leave you our deaths, give them their meaning. We were young, we have died. Remember us." And so, we owe them at least that much. We owe it to them to remember them, all those U.S. service members who died in war and military action. Of course, this speaks nothing of the servicemen and women who die by suicide during time of war. Suicide has become something of an epidemic in the active duty military service since 9/11. By 2012, the U.S. military lost more troops to suicide than to combat, and that continues to be true. Veteran suicide rates have been at an all-time high as well. And the war casualty numbers don't tell us how many returned from combat with debilitating physical injuries or debilitating mental injuries of other kinds. The numbers of war casualties don't tell us about the numbers of prisoners of war and missing in action. And they all deserve special remembrance. Memorial Day is also a good time to think of those who are in active duty right now, knowing that some of them are in harm's way, and all of them potentially could be sent in harm's way. We pray that they return home safely, and that once they are home, they will get the care that they need to attend to their wounds, physical and mental. Over the years, I have expanded my view of the holiday. I've come to believe that Memorial Day should also include a remembrance of civilian casualties and soldiers on the other side of the conflicts as well. I believe that we should pause to remember all of those people who died as a consequence of the battles that our country chose to fight, usually on someone else's soil. And most of those are civilian casualties. These sorts of numbers or statistics are much, much harder to find. It's probably conservative to say that 250,000 civilians have died in Iraq and Afghanistan, which is, of course, orders of magnitude greater than the 7,000 U.S. troops that died in combat in those conflicts. In war, civilian casualties typically outnumber those of the combatants, a fact too little remembered on Memorial Day or any day. One vivid example, World War II was the deadliest military conflict in human history. More than 60 million people were killed in World War II, which was more than 2.5% of the entire world population, which is impossible to imagine. And of those 60 million that died, 40 million were civilians, so about 2/3. It's hard to get good estimates of how many civilians have died in our wars, but no doubt the numbers are always staggering. And so today it's important to pause and remember those lives as well. Memorial Day, in my opinion, should be a day to include a consideration of how to end war. It shouldn't just be a day of saying war is hell and then shrugging it off and feebly saying war is inevitable. You can't do anything about it. It's true that there have been so many wars, that we've always had wars, but another way, another world is possible. And if humanity is to go on, we're going to have to figure out that other way. During the 60s, when the Cold War was really at peak mode and nuclear war was an ever-present threat in addition to the conventional war in Vietnam, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. famously said, "We must learn to live together as brothers or perish together as fools." In the 21st century, aside from a few moments of trepidation here and there in very recent years, the threat of nuclear war has not loomed quite as large in our psyche. But thanks to the aftermath of 9/11, we are in an era of permanent war, but on a scale small enough and far away enough that, particularly without a draft, most of us don't think about it very much. But today, unfortunately, I'm reminded of the classic novel 1984 by George Orwell. As you might recall, in 1984, there is a perpetual war being fought between these fictional nations of Oceania, Eurasia, and East Asia. And any combination of those three can be fighting, but there's always a war happening. And the point is that the war goes on forever is one of the ways that the oppressive government can control the citizenry, along with constant, ever-present surveillance. In 1984, the protagonist, Winston Smith, sometimes has trouble remembering whether his nation, Oceania, is at war with Eurasia or East Asia, or is it both? And I remember reading that book in school, and it seemed inconceivable that you wouldn't know what countries your nation was having a war with, what nations that your country was fighting with. Yet, here we are, and for me at least, sometimes it's hard to keep up with all the countries that we are striking with our military power. According to an official report from 2018, just last year, the United States is engaged in military action in Afghanistan and Iraq still, in Syria, in Yemen, in Somalia, in Libya, and Niger. Did you know that? In essence, the authorization for use of military force, which was passed shortly after 9/11, means that this war on terror can be anywhere and in many places at once, and it goes on, apparently with no end. A blank check, as a representative called it, for perpetual war. I feel bad critiquing my country's policies on a day that is often patriotic, like Memorial Day, and yet it feels like a patriotic duty to critique it at the same time. I have to tell you, I surprise myself sometimes with my patriotism. surprises me in the strangest moments. I get surprised how wrapped up I can get in the Olympics or the World Cup rooting for the USA. And when every once in a while I travel outside of this country, no matter what a great trip I might have had, when I come back and I go through U.S. Customs and they look at my passport and papers and make sure everything's in order, and they hand it back and they always say, "Welcome home." And every single time they say "welcome home," it kind of gets me. It kind of makes me verklempt. It takes me by surprise, always. And it's like the hymn we sang said, "This is my home, the country where my heart is. These are my hopes. Here are my hopes, my dreams, my sacred shrine." But as Martin Luther King Jr. said, there can be no deep disappointment where there is not deep love. I love this country deeply, and so our perpetual imperialistic warfare and the killing of civilians that we are responsible for around the world truly horrifies me. Because, like the hymn also says, other hearts and other lands are beating with hopes and dreams as true and high as mine. Today we remember these other beating hearts in other lands too. We know that every human life is sacred. Every life has inherent worth and dignity, and our faith calls us to act accordingly and insists that our government does the same. You don't have to be too cynical to see the connection between U.S. oil interests and war in modern times. After all, decades ago, two-time Congressional Medal of Honor winner General Smedley Butler said, "War is a racket. War is so often about protecting the interests of the rich." But what looms ahead looking deeper into the 21st century? Some believe, thanks to the global climate crisis, that we will be looking maybe not at wars over oil, but war over water. The global climate crisis has all the potential to create chaos and violence. The Religious Society of Friends, also known as the Quakers, say, war is not the answer. I'm sure most of us would agree, but if war isn't the answer and hard things happen, what is the answer? The sixth UU principle is the goal of world community with peace, liberty, and justice for all. How do we work toward that goal? How do you even begin to tackle that? Pope Paul VI said, "If you want peace, work for justice." I tend to agree. Perhaps our UU principle should be reworked a little bit to the goal of world community and peace through working for liberty and justice for all. I believe that one of the reasons that what people call the peace movement hasn't been more effective is that it's often really the anti-war movement. I would love to see UU's focus on the other peace movement, the positive peace movement, rather than just the focus on the negative peace movement or the anti-war movement. The positive peace movement recognizes that just ending a particular war is never enough to create lasting peace. If we get rid of war, then what? There's a huge void, and what peace fills that void? What does it look like? But there is good news. The good news is we don't have to be just powerless and passive and say war is inevitable. There's so much we can do to work for justice in the world. Stopping war is just one piece of the peace process, particularly if we want to build perpetual, boundaryless peace. Redirecting some of the trillions of dollars spent by the U.S. toward the war effort, toward people in need, would obviously be a good and important start and way, but there are other things to do as well. If we want lasting peace, we have to ensure that all children everywhere have basic rights, that they have their basic needs met. All children deserve the basic rights of access to education and access to health care. They deserve the basic right to clean water and clean air and nutrition, as well as shelter. And they will not have those basic rights. They will not have those basic fundamental needs met if they're in a war zone. It's not possible. And they will not have those basic rights or needs met if we don't do something serious and soon about the global climate crisis. The good news this Memorial Day is that if we do all that we need to do to fight the global climate crisis, including living sustainably, living more equitably, thinking locally and globally, including insisting that our government moves us towards sustainable and renewable resources, ensuring that our corporations behave appropriately along those lines as well, we will have gone a long, long way toward building peace. There's so much crossover in the goals, including racial justice crossover. Both war and ecological catastrophe disproportionately impact people of color. Both of these goals are enormous, but everyone on earth has something at stake, which also gives me hope. The work and the emergency level focus on building a green, sustainable economy could fill much of a void left by moving away from a war economy. Next year, next church year, I plan to put considerably more focus on the global climate crisis, and I hope that you will join me. The good news this Memorial Day, too, is that we can turn our swords into plowshares, and in fact, we are going to have to literally turn our swords into plowshares, or we will indeed perish together as fools. As Barbara Peskin put it in our opening words this morning, give us courage to answer the cry of humanity's pain, and with our bare hands, with all our intelligence, let us create the peace. May it be so. Blessed be, and amen. Friends, this Memorial Day weekend, may we remember our sacred duty to work for peace, for a lasting peace, the goal of world community. Everything we need to make this dream a reality, we have. We just have to have the will. May our will be done. Blessed be, and amen.